She stood in the center of a dirt floor, staring at a man whose boots were held together by twine. Lillian Hart thought she had traded a life of suffocating debt in Boston for a life of starving poverty in the Wyoming Territory. She was ready to run. She was ready to scream. What she didn't know was that the rough hands pouring her coffee signed checks that could buy the entire state. She didn't know that the man playing the pauper was actually sitting on a secret that men had died for. And she certainly didn't know that the rotting shack she hated was the only fortress standing between her and a war that was about to burn the West to the ground. This is the story of the mail-order bride who thought she settled for nothing only to realize she had married the king of the frontier. The rain in Boston didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker. Lillian Hart adjusted the collar of her threadbare coat, keeping her head down as she navigated the cobblestones of Wharf Street. The year was 1875, and the panic had left the city gasping for air. But for Lillian, the suffocation was personal. She clutched the letter in her pocket as if it were a shield. It was the only thing standing between her and Mr. Tobias Crowley. Crowley wasn't a banker. Bankers had hours and rules. Crowley was a shadow that loomed over her late father's tailoring shop, a man who collected debts with a smile that never reached his dead grey eyes. Her father had died 3 months ago, heart failure, brought on by the stress of owing Crowley $2,000, a fortune that Lillian, a seamstress making pennies on the hem, could never hope to repay. She turned the corner and froze. Standing in front of the boarding house where she rented a single room was one of Crowley's associates, a brute named O'Malley. He was leaning against the gas lamp, picking his teeth with a sliver of wood. Lillian didn't hesitate. She spun on her heel, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, and ducked into the alleyway, leading toward the post office. She couldn't go back. Not for her clothes, not for her mother's locket. She pulled the crinkled newspaper clipping from her pocket, reading it for the 100th time in the dim alley light. Wanted wife. Must be of sturdy constitution and honest character. Life is hard. Solitude is absolute. I offer a roof and protection. I offer no luxuries. Write to Jeremiah Holt, Blackwater Ridge, Wyoming Territory. It was the bleakest proposal she had ever seen. There were no promises of love, no mentions of gentle spirits or comfortable means, just hard work and a roof. But protection was the word that had snagged her. Lillian had spent the last of her savings on a telegraph and a train ticket. The correspondence had been brief. Jeremiah Holt was a man of few words. He had sent money for the ticket Union Pacific 3rd Class with a simple instruction: come alone. Tell no one. She reached the station, the steam and soot of the locomotives hitting her face. It smelled like escape. As she boarded the train, squeezing between a family of Swedish immigrants and a man smelling of stale tobacco, she looked back at the skyline of Boston. She was 24 years old, educated, and once she had dreamed of opening her own dress shop on Newbury Street. Now she was selling herself to a stranger in the middle of nowhere just to keep her kneecaps intact. The journey west was a blur of changing landscapes. The claustrophobic brick of the east gave way to the rolling green of the Midwest, and finally the imposing, terrifying vastness of the plains. By the time the train screamed into the station at Cheyenne, Lillian felt like she had been shed of her skin. Her dress was stained with soot. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion. She stepped onto the wooden platform, the wind whipping her hair across her face. It was late October, and the air here had teeth. Lillian Hart. The voice was deep, gravelly, like stones grinding together in a riverbed. She turned. The man standing there was terrifying. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that blocked out the afternoon sun. He wore a duster coat that had once been tan, but was now stained with oil and mud. His hat was pulled low, shadowing eyes that were dark and unreadable. A thick, dark beard covered half his face, unkempt and wild. But it was the boots that drew her eye. The leather was peeling, the soles looked thin, and the left one was wrapped with a piece of twine to keep the sole from flapping. This was Jeremiah Holt. Lillian felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. She had expected poor, the letter had warned her. But this man looked destitute. He looked like he had lost a fight with the land and was just waiting to die. "Mr. Holt?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand. He just nodded once, sharp and quick. "Truck. I have one bag," she said, gesturing to the battered valise at her feet. He scooped it up as if it weighed nothing. "Wagons this way." As she followed him through the bustling chaos of Cheyenne, past saloons roaring with piano music, cattlemen shouting deals and women in silk dresses laughing on balconies, Lillian felt a distinct sense of shrinking. Everyone seemed to have a purpose, a place. Jeremiah led her past the nice carriages, past the sturdy freight wagons to the very edge of the lot. There stood a buckboard wagon that looked like it had survived a war. The wood was grey and splintering. The horse attached to it was a massive, scarred roan that looked meaner than its owner. Jeremiah tossed her bag into the back. He climbed up the wood, groaning under his weight, and looked down at her. "You coming?" Lillian looked at the town behind her. She could try to find work here. She could be a maid, a washerwoman. But Crowley's reach was long, and she had no money for a room. She grit her teeth, lifted her skirts, and climbed onto the hard wooden bench beside him. "Let's go," she whispered. Jeremiah flicked the reins. They didn't speak for the first 4 hours. The landscape of Wyoming was beautiful in a way that hurt. It was vast, empty, and indifferent. They rode until the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. The silence between them was heavy. Lillian tried to study him from the corner of her eye. His hands were rough, the knuckles scarred. He drove with an easy competence, but his posture was rigid, alert. He scanned the horizon constantly, his eyes darting to the ridges and the valleys. Is it much farther?" Lillian finally asked, her throat dry. "Another hour," Jeremiah said. His voice was surprisingly articulate, lacking the heavy frontier drawl she had heard on the platform in Cheyenne. It was a flat, neutral accent. "You wrote that you offer a roof," Lillian said, trying to spark some conversation. "Do you farm cattle or crops?" Jeremiah let out a short, dry sound that might have been a laugh. "The land at Blackwater Ridge won't grow crops, Miss Hart. Too much rock. And I don't have enough grass for a herd." Lillian frowned. "Then, how do you survive?" He looked at her, then a fleeting glance. His eyes were a piercing, startling blue beneath the shadow of his hat, intelligent, intense, and guarded. "I get by," he said simply. "I hunt. I trade a little." Lillian's heart sank further. A hunter-gatherer. She had married a squatter. Night had fully fallen when they turned off the main trail onto a narrow, rocky path that wound up into the foothills. The temperature plummeted. Lillian shivered, wrapping her thin coat tighter. Without a word, Jeremiah reached behind the seat and pulled out a heavy wool blanket. He tossed it into her lap. It smelled of wood smoke and horse, but it was thick and warm. "Thank you," she murmured. He didn't reply. They crested a rise, and the moon illuminated a small valley bowl surrounded by jagged cliffs on 3 sides. In the center sat the homestead. Lillian had to stifle a gasp. It was a sod house, literally dug into the side of the hill, with a front wall made of stacked logs and earth. It looked less like a home and more like a bear's den. There was a small lean-to barn off to the side, leaning precariously. A single lantern hung from a hook by the door, swinging in the wind. "This is it," Jeremiah said, pulling the wagon to a halt. Lillian sat frozen. In Boston, even the poorest tenements had brick walls. This was dirt. She was going to live in dirt. Jeremiah hopped down and rounded the wagon to help her. For the first time, he was gentle. He took her waist to lift her down, and his grip was firm but respectful. "It isn't much," he said, his voice lowering. "But it's safe. No one comes up here." Because no one would want to, she thought bitterly. She walked to the door. It was heavy oak, oddly thick for such a ramshackle structure, and secured with a massive iron bolt. Jeremiah unlocked it and ushered her inside. The interior was one room. A cast-iron stove sat in the corner, radiating a dying heat. There was a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs and a bed in the far corner covered in furs. The floor was packed earth, swept clean. It was dismal. "I'll tend the horse," Jeremiah said. "There's stew in the pot on the stove. Eat." He left her alone. Lillian stood in the center of the room, fighting back tears of sheer exhaustion. "This is my life now," she told herself. "I am Mrs. Jeremiah Holt, mistress of a mud pit." She walked to the stove and lifted the lid of the pot. The smell of venison and sage wafted up. It actually smelled delicious. Her stomach growled traitorously. She found a tin bowl and spoon and served herself. As she ate, her eyes wandered the room. It was sparse, but as she looked closer, things didn't add up. The table she sat at was rough pine, but the chair was mahogany. It was old and scratched, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. It was a piece of fine furniture, the kind she'd seen in the wealthy parlors of Beacon Hill. She looked at the shelf above the bed. There were books, not just a Bible, but leather-bound volumes. She stood up and walked over, running her fingers along the spines. The Wealth of Nations, by Adam Smith. Principles of Geology, by Lyell. Meditations, by Marcus Aurelius. She pulled down a copy of Shakespeare's sonnets. It fell open to a marked page. In the margins, someone had written notes in a sharp, angular hand. The ink was high quality, not the cheap stuff that faded. "You like to read?" Lillian jumped, nearly dropping the book. Jeremiah was standing in the doorway. He had taken off his hat and duster. Without the shadows, he was younger than she thought, maybe 32. He was strikingly handsome, in a rugged, dangerous way, though his face was tired. Yes," Lillian stammered. "I didn't expect to find a library here." Jeremiah walked over to the stove and poured himself coffee from a tin pot. "Books are easy to carry. They don't eat much." He leaned against the wall, sipping the coffee, watching her. "You're disappointed." It wasn't a question. Lillian straightened her spine. "I'm surprised, Mr. Holt. You live simply. Yet you read philosophy and sit on a mahogany chair." Jeremiah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Debris from a past life. Don't read too much into it." "And the lock on the door." Lillian challenged her fear, giving way to frustration. It's a fortress built on a mud hut. Who are you afraid of, Jeremiah? Or should I ask who is afraid of you? Jeremiah set the cup down. The metal clinked loudly in the silence. He walked toward her, stopping just a few feet away. The air in the room seemed to compress. "There are wolves in these hills, Lillian," he said softly. "And things worse than wolves. You wanted protection from your debts in Boston. I'm giving it to you. But the price is that you don't ask questions about the past. Do we have an accord?" Lillian looked up at him. She saw the danger in him. Yes. But she also saw something else. A weary sadness. And beneath the dirt on his shirt, she noticed something she had missed before. He was wearing a ring on a chain around his neck, tucked under his shirt. The gold glinted in the lantern light. It was heavy, thick gold. "Accord," she whispered. "Good," he said. "Take the bed. I'll sleep in the barn tonight." You don't have to." "I do," he said firmly. "I didn't bring you here to dishonor you. We'll marry properly when the circuit preacher comes through next week. Until then, you take the bed." He turned to leave, grabbing his rifle from by the door. "Jeremiah." He paused, hand on the latch. "Who is Mr. Sterling?" she asked. Jeremiah froze. His knuckles turned white on the rifle stock. He turned back slowly. "Where did you hear that name?" "I saw it," she said, pointing to the Shakespeare book. "On the inside cover. Property of C. Sterling." Jeremiah's face went cold, a mask of stone. "Mr. Sterling is the man who owns this territory," Jeremiah said, his voice dropping to a growl. "He's the man who thinks he's good, and if he finds out you're here, God help us both." He slammed the door behind him. Lillian stood in the silence, the wind howling outside. She looked at the book, then at the heavy bolt on the door. She wasn't just a poor farmer's wife. She was a pawn in a game she didn't understand. And as she lay down on the furs, listening to the wind, she realized that Jeremiah Holt wasn't hiding from poverty. He was lying in wait. But for what? The first light of dawn didn't gently wake Lillian. It assaulted the sod house. The sun crested the eastern ridge and shot beams of light through the cracks in the wooden door, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the cold air. Lillian woke with a start, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress. For a moment she thought she was back in Boston, and the heavy weight on her chest was just the usual dread of debt. Then she smelled the earth, the rich, dry scent of packed dirt, and remembered where she was. She sat up. The room was empty. The heavy iron bolt on the door was unlatched. Jeremiah was gone. Lillian rose, wrapping the wool blanket around her shoulders like a shawl. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers. She added a few sticks of kindling from the pile, watching the flames lick the wood, before turning to survey her new domain in the daylight. It was cleaner than it had looked the night before, but undeniably poor. The floor was hard-packed earth. The walls were lined with old newspapers to keep the dirt from crumbling, a common trick for settlers, she knew. But reading the headlines from 1872 only added to the feeling of being trapped in the past. She found a note on the table weighed down by a heavy brass compass. "Gone to check the perimeter. Don't leave the valley bowl. Water is in the barrel outside. J. Check the perimeter," Lillian whispered. "Like a soldier." She dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, a grey calico that had seen better days, and stepped outside. The morning air was crisp and smelled of sagebrush and pine. The view, she had to admit, was spectacular. The valley was a golden bowl of tall grass, protected on all sides by granite cliffs that rose like jagged teeth. but her eyes were drawn to the barn. It sat about 50 yards from the house, leaning precariously to the left. The roof was patched with rusted tin and sod. It looked like a strong wind would flatten it. If Jeremiah was a farmer, his tools would be in there. If he was a hunter, his hides would be curing there. She needed to know what kind of life she had signed up for. She needed to know if they were going to starve come winter. She walked across the yard, her boots crunching on the frost-covered grass. The barn door was hanging on one hinge, secured only by a loop of rope. "Hello?" she called out softly. "Mr. Holt." Silence. She pulled the rope and squeezed through the gap. The inside of the barn was dim lit only by the shafts of light piercing through the gaps in the rotting siding. At first glance, it was exactly what she expected, a pile of junk. There was a rusted plough, broken harnesses, and a mound of moulding hay in the corner. But Lillian was a seamstress. Her entire life was built on noticing details: a missed stitch, a mismatched button, a hem that wasn't quite straight. And something about this barn wasn't straight. The dimensions were wrong. The outside of the barn appeared to be about 30 feet deep, but the back wall, a wall of stacked hay bales, was only 20 feet in. 10 feet were missing. Curiosity warred with fear. "Don't ask questions about the past," he had said. But this wasn't the past. This was her present. She walked toward the back wall. The hay bales were stacked neatly, too neatly. She pulled at one. It was heavy, but it shifted. Behind it wasn't a wooden wall, but a dark, oil-stained canvas tarp. Lillian's heart hammered against her ribs. She looked over her shoulder at the open door. The yard was empty. She pulled the tarp aside. There was a door. It wasn't a barn door. It was a heavy, reinforced steel door, the kind she had seen on the bank vaults in Boston. It was painted black to blend into the shadows, but the heavy iron wheel in the center gave it away. "What in God's name?" she breathed. She reached out and tried the wheel. It was locked tight. She stepped back, her mind racing. A bank vault door in a rotting barn in the middle of the Wyoming Territory. Why? What was he keeping in there? Gold. Stolen money. Was Jeremiah Holt a bank robber hiding out? That would explain the solitude. It would explain the paranoia. She looked down at the ground near the door. The dirt floor here was different. It wasn't packed earth. It was wood covered with a thin layer of dust to disguise it. She brushed the dirt away with her foot. It was a trap door. This one wasn't locked. It had a simple iron ring. Lillian gripped the ring with both hands and heaved. The trap door was heavy counterweighted, and it swung open with a smooth, well-oiled hiss of hydraulics that sounded utterly out of place in this primitive setting. Below, a ladder descended into darkness. But not total darkness. A faint chemical glow emanated from below. Lillian took a breath, gathered her skirts, and climbed down. The air shifted. It became cool and dry, smelling of paper oil and ozone. She reached the bottom and turned around. She gasped. She wasn't in a cellar. She was in an office, a command center. The room was dug deep into the earth, the walls reinforced with brick and timber. Several kerosene lamps burned low on the walls, providing a steady amber light. In the center of the room was a massive drafting table covered in maps, not rough sketches, but professional topographical surveys of the entire territory. They were pinned down, covered in complex mathematical calculations. On the walls were shelves lined not with food, but with geological samples. Rocks labeled with white tags, quartzite, pyrite, hematite. And in the corner, sitting on a sturdy desk, was a telegraph machine. A wire ran from it up the wall and disappeared into the ceiling. Lillian walked to the drafting table. She ran her hand over the largest map. It was a map of Blackwater Ridge and the surrounding county. The map was color-coded. Most of the land was marked in red, labeled C. Sterling. But a thin blue vein ran through the center of the map, cutting through Sterling's red empire. It started right here at Jeremiah's homestead and snaked down into the valley. The legend at the bottom read, Blackwater Aquifer. Primary access point. Underneath that, stamped in red ink, deed holder Jeremiah Holt. Lillian stared at it. She understood enough about the West to know that water was more valuable than gold. If Jeremiah owned the water source, he wasn't poor. He held the throat of the entire valley in his hand. She moved to the desk. There were ledgers. She opened one. It wasn't a list of debts. It was a list of offers. May 12th, 1874. Sterling offers $5,000. Declined. August 4th, 1874. Sterling offers $10,000. Declined. September 4th, 1874. Barn burned. Warning shot. October 15th, 1874. Offer $50,000. Declined. $50,000. Lillian had almost sold herself for $2,000. Jeremiah had turned down a fortune that could build a palace. I told you not to ask questions. The voice came from the top of the ladder. Lillian spun around, clutching the ledger to her chest. Jeremiah was standing at the top of the hatch, his silhouette blocking the light. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. He climbed down the ladder slowly, his boots thudding softly on the wooden floor. He walked past her, took the ledger from her hands and closed it gently. "You're not a farmer," Lillian whispered. You're a millionaire." Jeremiah let out a bitter laugh. "I'm a man with a piece of paper that says I'm rich and a gun to my head that says I'm dead if I try to cash it." He walked to the map. "I was a surveyor for the Union Pacific. I found the aquifer 5 years ago. I bought the deed before Sterling knew it was here. He bought all the land around me, thinking he could squeeze me out, thinking the water was on his land. When he found out the source was here, well," he looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "Sterling controls the town. He controls the law. If I sell to him, he dams the water and charges the farmers in the valley 10 times what it's worth. He starves them out and takes their land. I'm the only thing stopping him from turning this territory into his own private kingdom." "So you live like a pauper," Lillian said, the realization washing over her. "To hide." "To survive," Jeremiah corrected. "If I flash money, I put a target on my back. If I leave, he takes the land. So I stay. I sit on this rock, and I hold the line." He stepped closer to her. "I needed a wife, Lillian, because under the Homestead Act, a married man can claim double the acreage if he files an extension. It secures the southern ridge. It makes it harder for him to legally steal it." Lillian felt a chill. "I'm a legal maneuver." Jeremiah's expression softened. He reached out his rough hand, hovering near her face, before dropping to his side. "You're a partner. I didn't expect you to be so smart, or so brave." He sighed. "Get your coat. We need supplies. And if we're going to survive this, you need to see the enemy." "We're going to town." "Yes," Jeremiah said, his eyes hardening. "Into the lion's den." The ride to town took 2 hours. The silence in the wagon was different now. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers. It was the heavy, charged silence of conspirators. Jeremiah had made her change. He made her wear her oldest dress, and he rubbed a little dust onto the hem. "We have to look beaten," he told her. "Sterling feeds on weakness. If he thinks we're proud, he strikes. If he thinks we're desperate, he waits for us to break." As they crested the final hill, the town of Blackwater Ridge sprawled out below them. It was surprisingly large for the territory. There were 2 main streets forming a cross. To the west there were shanties, tents, and rough timber buildings, the miners and the transient workers. To the east the buildings were brick and painted white, and dominating the center of town, sitting on a raised foundation like a throne, was the Sterling Hotel. It was 3 stories tall with a wraparound porch and glass windows that must have cost a fortune to ship from the east. "Stay close to me," Jeremiah murmured as he guided the horses onto the main street. "Don't speak unless spoken to, and whatever you do, don't look Caleb Sterling in the eye." The town was busy. Men on horseback, women with shopping baskets, wagons loaded with timber. But as Jeremiah's battered wagon rolled through the noise, seemed to dip. Heads turned. People whispered. Lillian felt the eyes on them. They weren't looking with curiosity. They were looking with pity and fear. Jeremiah pulled the wagon up to the hitching post in front of Higgins's general store. He hopped down and helped her out. "Head down," he reminded her. They entered the store. It smelled of coffee beans, leather, and sawdust. The shopkeeper, a stout woman named Mrs. Higgins, was behind the counter. She stiffened when she saw Jeremiah. "Mr. Holt," she said, her voice cool. "We didn't expect to see you until next month." "Ran low on flour," Jeremiah said, his voice taking on that rough, uneducated drawl he had used at the train station. He hunched his shoulders, making himself look smaller. "And I brought the wife." Mrs. Higgins looked at Lillian. Her eyes raked over Lillian's dusty dress. "So I heard. Mail order, was it?" Lillian wanted to snap back, but she remembered Jeremiah's warning. She looked at the floor. "Yes, ma'am." "Well," Mrs. Higgins sniffed, "I suppose you'll need the basics. But your credit is thin, Mr. Holt. Very thin." "I got cash," Jeremiah mumbled, patting his pocket. As they moved through the aisles, picking out sacks of flour, beans, and coffee. Lillian felt a simmering rage. She knew Jeremiah could buy this entire store 5 times over with the gold she had seen samples of in the bunker. But he had to beg for beans. The bell above the door chimed. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. The low hum of conversation stopped instantly. Lillian turned slowly. A man stood in the doorway. He was flanked by 2 other men, large gunslingers with low-slung holsters. But the man in the center drew all the attention. He was in his 50s, wearing a pristine grey suit that was impeccably tailored. He held a silver-tipped cane, though he walked without a limp. His hair was silver and swept back, and his face was handsome, smooth, and utterly predatory. This was Caleb Sterling. He surveyed the room like a king surveying his court. His eyes landed on Jeremiah. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "Well, well," Sterling said. His voice was smooth like oiled silk. "If it isn't the Hermit of the Hills." He walked toward them. The sound of his cane tapping on the floorboards was the only sound in the room. Jeremiah didn't turn around fully. He kept his head low. "Mr. Sterling." "I heard you fetched yourself a bride, Jeremiah," Sterling said, stopping just a few feet away. He looked at Lillian. His gaze felt like a physical touch, slimy and invasive. A city girl, by the looks of her. Boston. Lillian stayed silent. She has spirit, Sterling mused. Or she's mute. Which is it? She's shy, Jeremiah said quickly, stepping slightly in front of Lillian. We're just getting supplies, Mr. Sterling. We don't want no trouble. Sterling laughed. It was a cold, barking sound. Trouble, Jeremiah, you are the trouble. You're a stain on the progress of this valley. You're a tick on the back of a thoroughbred. He stepped closer, invading Jeremiah's personal space. My offer still stands. 50,000. That's a lot of money for a man who wears boots held together with string. You could take your pretty little wife to San Francisco, buy her a silk dress, instead of this. He gestured vaguely at Lillian's dusty clothes. Jeremiah's hands were clenched at his sides. Lillian saw the tendons straining. He wanted to kill this man. She could feel the violence radiating off him. But Jeremiah forced his hands open. I like my land, Mr. Sterling. It's home. It's a grave, Sterling hissed. And sooner or later you're going to fall into it. Sterling turned his attention back to Lillian. He reached out, and before Jeremiah could stop him, lifted Lillian's chin with the tip of his gloved finger. You're a pretty thing, Sterling said softly. When you get tired of starving up there in the dirt, you come see me at the hotel. I have a suite with a bathtub and hot water. Jeremiah moved. It was a subtle shift, a tensing of his shoulders, but the two gunmen behind Sterling instantly dropped their hands to their pistols. Lillian saw it. She knew if Jeremiah fought, he died. Right here in the flower aisle. She jerked her chin away from Sterling's finger. I prefer the dirt, she said. Her voice was clear, crisp, and undeniably Bostonian. It's cleaner. The store went deathly silent. Mrs. Higgins gasped behind the counter. Sterling stared at her. For a second his eyes flashed with genuine anger. Then he chuckled. Cleaner, he repeated. We'll see how clean you feel when the snow comes, my dear. We'll see. He tipped his hat mockingly to Jeremiah. Tick-tock, Jeremiah. The railroad is coming in the spring. I want that water rights deed before the first track is laid, or I'll take it from your cold, dead hands. He spun on his heel and walked out, his henchmen trailing behind him. Lillian let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Her knees felt weak. Jeremiah grabbed her arm. His grip was tight. Pay, he said to the counter. Now. He threw a coin onto the counter. It wasn't a few copper pennies. It was a heavy gold eagle, a $20 piece. Mrs. Higgins stared at the gold coin, then at Jeremiah's ragged coat. Her eyes narrowed. Keep the change, Jeremiah growled. He grabbed the sack of flour and ushered Lillian out the door, moving fast. You shouldn't have spoken, Jeremiah hissed as he threw the supplies into the wagon. He touched me, Lillian said, her voice shaking. I wasn't going to let him treat me like a... He was baiting me, Lillian. Jeremiah climbed onto the seat and hauled her up. He wanted me to draw. If I draw, his men shoot me in self-defense, and he takes the land legally the next morning. That's how he works. He snapped the reins and the wagon lurched forward, fleeing the town. He's a monster, Lillian said. He's a businessman, Jeremiah said grimly. And he's losing patience. The railroad coming. That changes everything. That's his deadline. Jeremiah looked at her, his face pale. And now he knows about you. He knows you're not just a farm girl. He knows you have fire. That makes you a target. What do we do? Lillian asked. Jeremiah looked at the horizon where storm clouds were gathering over the mountains. We stop hiding, he said. If he wants a war, we give him one. But we can't do it alone. We need allies." "Who?" Lillian asked. "Everyone in that town is terrified of him." "Not everyone," Jeremiah said. "There's a man, an old friend. He runs the freight line out of Laramie. A man named Silas. No, not Silas. He corrected himself. A man named Dutch Van Doren. He hates Sterling almost as much as I do. And if he won't help..." Jeremiah reached under the seat and pulled out a heavy canvas-wrapped object. He unwrapped it to reveal a shiny lever-action Winchester rifle. He handed it to her. "Then you better learn how to use this." The first snow of the season didn't drift gently down to Blackwater Ridge. It arrived with the violence of a fist fight. The wind howled through the canyons, stripping the last of the autumn leaves from the cottonwoods and coating the valley floor in a sheet of blinding white. Inside the sod house, the atmosphere was grim. For 3 days, Jeremiah had drilled Lillian. It wasn't the courtship of a newlywed couple. It was the boot camp of a soldier. "Again," Jeremiah commanded, standing in the biting wind behind the house. Lillian raised the Winchester. Her shoulder was bruised a deep purple from the recoil aching with every heartbeat. Her fingers were numb inside her gloves. But she didn't complain. She sighted the empty tin can, perched on a fence post, 50 yards away. Breath in, breath out. Squeeze. Crack. The can spun into the air, a jagged hole through its center. "Good," Jeremiah grunted. He didn't offer praise, just affirmation. "Now reload. Do it while walking backward. Eyes up." Lillian fumbled with the lever, her hands shaking. "Do you really think he'll come this soon? In this weather?" Jeremiah scanned the ridgeline, his eyes narrowed against the glare of the snow. "Sterling is arrogant, but he isn't stupid. He knows the snow locks us in. He knows no one can get up that Alt trail from Towtown easily. If he's going to make a move, he'll do it before the drifts get too deep for horses. He'll want to make it look like an accident. A fire in winter. Tragic." He took the rifle from her, his fingers brushing hers. For a moment, the tension broke. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the exhaustion in her eyes and the determination in her jaw. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "This isn't the life you were promised." Lillian rubbed her sore shoulder. "The letter said hard work and no luxuries. You didn't lie, Jeremiah. You just omitted the war." "I have money," Jeremiah said suddenly. "In the bunker. There's a safe behind the map rack. There's enough gold in there to get you to Paris. If this goes wrong, you take the tunnel. It comes out a 1/4 mile down the creek bed. You take the gold, you take the horse, and you don't look back." Lillian stiffened. "I ran away from one debt in Boston, Jeremiah. I'm not running again." Jeremiah looked like he wanted to argue, but the sound of a snapping twig froze them both. It wasn't a deer. It was too heavy. "Inside," Jeremiah whispered. "Now." They moved quickly, barring the heavy oak door. Jeremiah killed the lantern, plunging the room into grayness, lit only by the embers of the stove. He moved to the window shutter, peering through the crack. "How many?" Lillian breathed, clutching the Winchester. "5, Jeremiah murmured. "Riders, coming up the creek bed to mask the sound." He turned to her. "They aren't here to talk. Go to the trap door. Get into the bunker. Lock it from the bottom." "No," Lillian said. She racked the lever of her rifle. "I'm staying." "Lillian! Smash!" A bottle flew through the small window, shattering against the far wall. The smell of kerosene filled the room instantly. A second later, a burning rag landed in the puddle of oil. Whoosh! Flames erupted, licking up the newspaper-lined walls. "Fire!" Jeremiah roared. He grabbed a wool blanket and started beating at the flames, but the oil had soaked into the dry earth and paper. The smoke was already thick, acrid, and choking. "Come out, Holt!" a voice shouted from outside. It wasn't Sterling's smooth baritone. It was a rough, drunk shout. "Come out and burn!" Bullets began to tear through the wooden front of the house. Splinters rained down on them. "We can't stay here." Jeremiah coughed, the smoke stinging his eyes. "The roof will collapse." "The bunker," Lillian yelled. "No time. If we open the trapdoor now, they'll see it when they breach. They'll find the command center. We have to draw them away." Jeremiah grabbed his coat and his rifle. "I'm going out the front. I'll draw their fire toward the rocks. You go out the back window. Run for the barn ruins. Hide in the hay." "Jeremiah, you'll be killed. Go!" He shoved her toward the back. Jeremiah kicked the front door open and dove out, rolling into the snow. He fired 3 rapid shots. Bang, 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 dropping one of the riders instantly. "He's out! Get him!" Lillian scrambled through the small back window, tearing her dress, tumbling into the freezing mud behind the house. She could hear the shouting, the thunder of hooves, and the deafening cracks of gunfire. She didn't run to the barn. She ran to the corner of the house. She saw Jeremiah huddled behind the water barrel, pinned down by 3 riders circling him. A 4th man was dismounting, walking toward the burning door, with a torch intending to finish the job. Lillian raised the Winchester. She remembered the lesson. Breath out. She aimed not at the rider, but at the man on the ground with the torch. Crack! The bullet struck the man in the leg. He screamed, dropping the torch into the snow. The riders spun around, confused by the new angle of fire. Flanked! "He's got to help!" Jeremiah used the distraction. He stood up, exposed, and fired with terrifying precision. One rider fell. Another's horse reared, throwing him. The remaining 2 men, realizing this wasn't a slaughter, but a fight, panicked. They spurred their horses' turning tail and galloping back down the valley into the darkness. "Lillian!" Jeremiah's voice was ragged. She ran to him. He was slumped against the water barrel, clutching his left side. Blood was seeping through his fingers, dark and steaming in the cold air. "I'm here," she cried, dropping to her knees. "Oh God, you're hit." "Just a graze," he lied through gritted teeth. His face was grey. "Help me. Help me to the barn, to the bunker." The house was fully engulfed now, the flames roaring into the night sky. It was a beacon. Everyone in the valley would see it burning. They would think Jeremiah Holt was dead. Lillian threw his arm over her shoulder. She was smaller than him, but fear gave her strength. She dragged him across the snowy yard, through the broken barn door, and to the trap door. Getting him down the ladder was a nightmare. He slipped halfway down, groaning in agony, landing heavily on the floor of the bunker. Lillian sealed the trapdoor above them, spinning the locking wheel until it clicked. The sounds of the fire and the wind vanished, replaced by the humming silence of the underground fortress. She rushed to him, tearing open his coat. The bullet had caught him in the side, just above the hip. It wasn't fatal, but he had lost a lot of blood. "The medical kit," Jeremiah wheezed, pointing to a metal box on the wall. "Whiskey, in the desk." For the next hour, Lillian Hart wasn't a seamstress. She was a field medic. She cleaned the wound, stitched the torn flesh with steady hands, skills from her needlework, finally finding a gruesome purpose, and bound him tight. Jeremiah passed out from the pain halfway through. When he finally drifted into a feverish sleep, Lillian washed the blood from her hands in a basin of cold water. She looked around the room. Her home upstairs was gone. They were trapped underground. Sterling would think they were dead at least for a day or two. She walked to the telegraph machine in the corner. Jeremiah had mentioned a name, Dutch Van Doren. She didn't know the code. She didn't know the protocol. But she saw a small notebook next to the machine labeled Cipher. She opened it. It was complex, a series of alphanumeric codes. But on the last page there was a simple instruction: emergency contact. Laramie Freight. Lillian sat down. She had never used a telegraph key, but she knew the rhythm of the Morse code from the newspapers. Dot, dash, dot. She began to tap. It was clumsy, slow. SOS. BLACKWATER. HOLT. DOWN. She waited. Silence. She tapped it again. And again. For an hour she sat in the dim light, tapping out her plea into the void. Then the machine clicked. The ticker tape began to spool out. RECEIVED. WHOIS. THIS. Lillian stared at the paper. She tapped back. HIS. WIFE. A pause. Then the machine chattered furiously. HOLD. FAST. DUTCH. IS. ROLLING. Lillian slumped back in the chair. She looked at Jeremiah sleeping on the cot. "Rest, husband," she whispered. "The cavalry is coming." 2 days passed in the subterranean gloom. While Jeremiah fought off a fever from his gunshot wound, Lillian became the strategist. Scouring the bunker's ledgers, she uncovered the staggering truth. Jeremiah wasn't just hoarding water rights. Under the alias J.H. Holdings, he had been quietly buying Union Pacific stock for years. He wasn't hiding. He was waiting. He held the leverage to force the railroad through their valley, the southern route which would render Caleb Sterling's northern land investments worthless. Sterling wasn't just greedy. He was leveraged to the hilt and terrified of bankruptcy. "You're squeezing him," Lillian realized, staring at the geological maps. "If the railroad board sees these surveys, they'll vote for your route. Sterling will be ruined." "That's the plan," Jeremiah rasped from his cot. "But he's desperate. He'll burn everything to find these maps." Suddenly, 3 rhythmic knocks echoed on the hatch. It wasn't Sterling. It was the cavalry. Dutch Van Doren descended the ladder, followed by 2 men lugging a crate containing a carriage-mounted Gatling gun. "Sterling thinks you're dead," Dutch grunted, shaking Jeremiah's hand. "The town is already celebrating." "Let them," Lillian said, her voice steel. "We need to get these original survey maps to the railhead before the supply train leaves tonight. It's the only way to end this legally." "The roads are watched," Dutch warned. "We'll never get a wagon through." "Then we take the river," Lillian countered. "The rapids are dangerous, but they're open. It's the only path he won't guard." Jeremiah tried to stand, wincing as his wound tore. "I'm going." "You can't walk, let alone row," Lillian said firmly. She wrapped the maps in oilskin and strapped the tube to her back. "I'll take the skiff. I'll get the proof to the conductor. Dutch, you come with me. Jeremiah, can you hold the bunker?" Jeremiah looked at the Gatling gun, then at his wife, no longer a terrified seamstress, but a commander. "I can hold the line," he said. "Go." They dragged the logging skiff into the freezing, churning waters of the Blackwater River. As Lillian and Dutch pushed off into the violent current, the first roar of the Gatling gun echoed from the ridge behind them. Jeremiah was drawing the enemy's fire. Now, Lillian had to survive the water to deliver the death blow to Sterling's empire. The river run was a blur of ice and terror. Dutch steered the skiff through the crushing rapids, beaching it just as the Union Pacific No. 119 began to pull away. Lillian didn't hesitate. Soaked and freezing, she scrambled onto the moving locomotive, shoving the oilskin tube into the stunned conductor's hands. "Get these to the board in Cheyenne tonight," she screamed over the steam whistle. "It saves the company millions." The train chugged east, carrying the proof that would destroy Sterling. Back at the ridge, Jeremiah was down to his last bullet. Sterling's men had the bunker surrounded. Just as Sterling ordered the final assault, the ground shook not with dynamite, but with hooves. Lillian returned leading a squad of U.S. Marshals. "It's over, Caleb," Lillian announced, sliding off her horse. "The board voted an hour ago. They chose the southern route. Your land is worthless, and the bank has called your loans." Sterling, realizing his empire had evaporated, raised his cane gun in a desperate rage. A marshal's shot shattered it from his hand. As he was dragged away in chains, screaming at a kingdom he no longer owned, Jeremiah stumbled from the bunker, bloody, but alive. Lillian caught him, and there, amidst the ashes of the war, they had won. Jeremiah finally placed the heavy gold ring on her finger. 3 years later, the sod hut was gone, replaced by a white timber mansion overlooking a booming rail town. Lillian Hart had come west expecting poverty, but she found a partner of fortune and a fight worth winning. She hadn't just married a farmer, she had built an empire. Lillian Hart proved that in the Wild West, the most dangerous weapon wasn't a revolver. It was a woman with a plan. She saved her husband, ruined a tyrant, and secured a legacy that would last forever. If you loved this story of justice and romance on the frontier, please like and subscribe. Did you expect Lillian to save the day? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching.